Thank you very much. We'll begin, apologize for the delay, with the afternoon session here. We have some very distinguished election officials and others who will be providing testimony over the course of the afternoon. But I think we'll begin now, and I think probably the order will follow here, just essentially because it appears as such on the agenda, is to begin with Matt Masterson.
Thank you, Chairman Bauer, Chairman Ginsburg, and Commissioners. I appreciate the opportunity. And I know I'm about 5 hours late, but welcome to the great state of Ohio. And thank you for coming. We're just a sleepy little Midwestern state that no one really hears about in the elections world. So
I never came up once in my experience with the Obama campaign.
I didn't think it would, yeah. So I appreciate.
We tried.
I appreciate the opportunity to talk here today, and I appreciate the fact that you all would come out to my hometown of Cincinnati, Ohio. I encourage everyone to get some Cincinnati-style chili while you're there. It's wonderful. I want to take this brief moment just to talk about sort of the state of certification, voting systems, and impact on election officials as it stands now, to try to tee up both what Kenneth and Dana are going to talk about as far as why they're moving the direction they're moving. Because I think if you understand the state of where we are now and the challenges for election officials now, it kind of speaks directly to why Kenneth and Dana are looking to do what they're going to do. And the first is the voting systems. As we heard this morning, our voting systems are a challenge right now. These are complex IT systems that are being asked to stretch much further than most IT systems would ever be asked to stretch. The systems have, when well maintained, held up well, performed well, but the reality is they're getting old, and maintaining and sustaining them is becoming increasingly more expensive and challenging for election officials. The reality is that the cost of sustaining these systems, both for big and especially for small jurisdictions, is becoming untenable, and they're being forced to look at new systems. Part of the frustration for many election officials right now is it's tough to find where those new systems are. We heard from the vendors this morning. It was encouraging to hear about the development, but the reality is, the future is now. Election officials are inherently planners and desire the need to plan ahead, particularly when talking about huge outlays of money and technology and changing the way that they do things. And the challenge now is it's impossible to plan for something that we haven't seen yet. We know about the concepts. We've seen some of the concepts and seen some of the systems that are proposed, but they're not through certification. Ohio is a state that requires EAC certification, which I'll touch on in just a minute. But they're not through certification, and there's no availability. And so as I get calls from counties about how to move forward, the question becomes, well, what are you looking to do and what's available? And right now, it's very limited as to what they're looking at. And so the question becomes, how much longer can I stretch out this system? How much longer can I sustain this system? And in Ohio, that's in the face of challenges with counties and budget and county commissioners. The reality is, when looking at a county budget, it's very tempting for county commissioners to want to cut things like system maintenance and system support on a voting system, because to those county commissioners, this is something that's used once or twice a year and then stored back, somewhere else, taking up storage money, storage time, space for the county. And the question becomes, what do we do with these voting systems and how do we keep them running? Election officials desire the state-of-the-art, but in many cases can't acquire the state-of-the-art and, frankly, don't know how to support the state-of-the-art. And I think that's an important concept to talk about. We heard a lot of buzzwords this morning that I think are really important: nimble, integration, multi-interfaced systems. And those are all important concepts to us as election officials. But the question is, at what cost do those systems come about? Not only cost in dollars, but cost in procedures and process. And that's where I think we really need to challenge ourselves. This morning it was mentioned, Commissioner Thomas mentioned the fact that election officials now want to take ownership of their voting system, and not just in the very real ownership sense, but ownership of the programming, ownership of the support, ownership of maintaining that system. And that means that election officials must be challenged to think of themselves as IT managers. And so that begs the question, if an election official is an IT manager, what are the core competencies that election official must have in order to support those systems? Because even with the voting systems we have today, which are complex systems as well, there's a simplicity to the fact that we talk about the voting system, the voter registration system, these peripherals that come about. If we're talking about integrating all of those things, we're talking about integrating all of the data that goes into those things, all of the systems that go into those things. We have now created a level of complexity that's far beyond what we're working with now, and election officials, in owning the process and owning the systems, need to begin and challenge themselves to think as IT managers and what exactly those competencies look like. And I think, as far as the evolving landscape of elections and election officials, that to me is the real changing dynamic, because we can't, as election officials, especially in a state like Ohio, do anything but own the issues with the systems, own the challenges with the systems, and how to move forward. You can't get up there and say, well, the vendor, that's not an option. That's not okay or acceptable anymore, and it shouldn't be. Certification. As I mentioned, Ohio requires certification. We had some conversation this morning. I think it's important to say that as a state that requires EAC certification, our systems are better systems because of the EAC certification. There are challenges with certification. There are issues with timing that I'll talk about in just a minute, but it's extremely important that you hear that the certification process, in whatever form it takes, is a vital part of what Ohio does in running voting systems. It has improved the systems in the state of Ohio. With that said, it's important to understand the challenges with certification. The reality is the time frames to deploy improvements to systems, so modifications to systems, are incredibly tight. If you start from Election Day in November, which doesn't even take into account the other election days throughout the course of the year, and begin to work your way backwards to look at the time that it takes to certify the modification at the EAC, the time that it takes to get the vendor in and certify the system here in Ohio, and then deploy the system to whatever counties, in reality, you're talking about a 1, maybe 2-month window in any given non-federal election year in a state like Ohio. That's the kind of window you're looking at for a modification for the state of Ohio. That's incredibly tight. And attempting to sync up modifications or changes to our system with the EAC process is challenging, because the EAC has to deal with 50 different timeframes that people would like to sync up. And so while it's frustrating and hard for us to deal with, the reality is that election officials need to begin to take ownership of the certification process as well, and begin to dictate timelines to the certifiers to make clear what our expectations are in order to get modifications fielded and systems improved. So that's really what I have today. Hopefully it sets up what Kenneth and Dana are going to talk about the challenges they face and why they're headed that direction. And I appreciate, again, the opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bennett?
Thank you, Commissioner Bauer and Commissioner Ginsburg, on behalf of Dean Logan, the Registrar of LA County, for having us back here again to give testimony. I know Dean gave testimony in the Denver hearing. And in his testimony, one of the things he really focused on was improving the voter experience using an innovative voter center approach to designing and validating that experience. And so I really wanted to come today to talk to you about that process. One of the points that was made earlier, and I'm going to try to touch on some of the things that I heard in the first session. One of the ones that really struck me, though, was Merle's comment about how other industries, they crystallize what they do in terms of technology standards and implementation around a single goal. And it kind of occurred to me that what I was going to present today really jived well with that, and that is the single thing that everything that we do should be crystallized around is the voter. And if you think about the voter as the one element that gives confidence to what we do, that legitimizes the election of new administrations, legitimizes the governments that govern us, then really it all comes down to that. There's a lot of discussion around the technology debate. We heard earlier there's a lot of discussion around the standards debate. And, how can we make this all work? But what we realized early on, back in 2008, 2009, when we realized our system was at the end of life and we needed to implement a new system. But what we saw was that, first of all, there was nothing out there in the marketplace that was really going to work for our county, Los Angeles County, with its size and its complexity and its diversity. We saw that the regulatory environment was dysfunctional. We saw that trust and confidence in the voting systems were eroding. We saw that elections administration was becoming very politicized and polarized. And in this environment, we realized that this wasn't just about implementing a voting system that met certain standards that went through a certification process, that it was really about much more than that, and that it was about the voter. And if the voter is confident in the processes that we administer, then fundamentally we're doing our job. So at the beginning of the project, rather than start off with requirements and try to figure out how we're going to get a system that works for our needs, we started out by just talking to the voters. We first held a symposium of voters in 2009. We conducted surveys of voters and poll workers. We held focus groups with many different demographic targeted groups of voters to get their understanding of what they felt about flexibility and accessibility and integrity and those values that we talk about. And then we started an innovative design process with IDEO. It's a global consultancy that focuses on design and innovation. And what we wanted to do was we really wanted to make the implementation process of a new voting system not about systems or about standards or about operations. What we wanted to do was understand what the voter needed. And so when we started off with IDEO, one of let me back up here and just say the process that IDEO uses is called empathetic design. And in that empathetic design, they conduct interviews with voters and try to understand how they feel about processes or a product, and try to really, from that process, glean insights and touch points about how the voter thinks about a product or a process. And they do this iteratively, and from that they come up with ideas that will sort of lead to new concepts, and they go back and to the voter and or to the user, the intended audience, and iterate through that and try to get closer and closer to something that really meets their needs. One of the things that came out of that process was that far too much we focus on elections as kind of a linear journey that's disconnected, where we bring voters into the process at a certain point before the election, try to give them as much information as they can, and then they vote, and then they disappear. One of the things that from our work with IDEO was really trying to see voting as a cyclical process, as a journey that's always happening. The voter is always engaged, and how can we, as election administrators, think about how do we keep the voter engaged in the democratic process, especially in a world, and I think this was mentioned earlier by some of the vendors and the great work that they're doing, is that landscape is changing. The voters have many different expectations now about what technology is going to be able to do for many different things, and they also have concerns about what technology can do wrong. And so we want to try to be able to engage the voter, understand the voter, and provide tools and services for them that will continually reinforce their trust in the voting, the elections administration process. So one of the other findings of our work with IDEO was that the field research with the voters identified 3 different types of what they call voter archetypes. Well, one was community voters, or voters who view the voting experience as a community building activity or as an opportunity to interact or bond with family members, friends, and neighbors. There's impact voters who are motivated by a desire to have an impact on society and to know that their vote counts and their participation in the democratic process is meaningful. And there's convenience voters, voters who, due to their work or their lifestyle, their personal needs, seek convenience and flexibility in when and where and how they vote. And I think what we heard earlier today about the future of technology from the vendors, we heard a lot of these same kinds of needs echoed in some of the work and the findings that they do. But so looking at the concept of a cyclical journey and the voter archetypes, our work with IDEO came up with a blueprint for how to move forward with the implementation of a system that focused not just on the voting device, but also on tools and services that could be used to keep the voter engaged leading up to it, the preparatory types of services, and also the tools and services to stay connected afterwards. So we had findings that there might be tools and services for voters that might cluster along a preparatory spectrum of the voting experience, such as voting early, voting anywhere, pre-marking a ballot on some type of a device that allow you to come in and just scan it. On the staying connected side, there are tools and services that might help the impact voter, such as providing audit reports online or being able to track your ballot all the way through the process, an anonymous ballot, but be able to track it and know where it is, the same way you track a package in a delivery. And then also for community voters, ideas around election day and enabling voters to let people know when and where they voted, to share that experience, that I voted experience on social media, and then especially just rethinking the layout and the flow of the voter experience within the poll. So we're at a stage in the process where we're doing this type of work and coming up with designs for a system, and we are working with a VSAP advisory committee, which is a body of community leaders, and getting their input. These designs are going back out to the voter for validation, and they will do that repeatedly. And we also are engaging with a very esteemed group of academics and technical people for our technical advisory committee, some of them who are here today, to also validate some of the more technical aspects of the project. But I guess what I'm trying to get at in a not so direct way is that the VSAP is a participatory project. We feel that the only way to get past or solve or resolve a lot of these issues that we face in terms of what is the right amount of standards, what is the right technology, how do we handle the accessibility portion, how do we handle the paper versus electronic debate. I mean, we can talk about that all day here. We're all professionals in this field, and in a certain way, it's a profession for a profession's sake if we don't keep the voter involved in that process. So we feel that we don't know where the VSAP is going to end up in terms of how we ultimately implement the system, that's a process that's going to happen as we go forward. But we feel that if we are continually validating what it is that we're trying to do through engagement with voters, through engagement with other stakeholders, and having an open, transparent, participatory process, that we will be able to get past many of these issues. And it's not going to be easy. That was mentioned earlier. It's not going to be easy. But we feel like that's the only way to come out successfully on the other side, because in the end, as I started out in the beginning, if the voter is confident in how we administer elections, and believe me, I say that from the standpoint of someone who is on the ground on election night, staying up late, dealing with many different types of issues that election administrators face. If we can gain the confidence of them, then to a certain extent, it doesn't really matter what the solution is. If the solution is building the trust and confidence of the voter in our process, then that's what's successful. No amount of academic study or opining on from one stakeholder group or another is going to solve that. It really is a collective, participatory process. And I would argue, lastly, in closing, that as we're doing that, we should be collecting data. And letting data-driven analysis, understanding what our voters want to really solve those issues. I mean, we're not going to solve them around the table here very easily because many people here have particular viewpoints. So I would say even with standards, things like determining what are valid standards, maybe that's something that needs to go out to the voters, so that, and collecting data on that, so we understand really what is going to make the voter confident. I mean, if it ends up being electronic voting, then maybe that's what it ends up being. But again, I'm not prescribing a solution. I'm just saying that the process needs to be voter driven. So
Thank you very much.
thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank
Ms.
you.
DeBoer.
Good afternoon, Dana DeBevois, Travis County, and that's Austin, Texas. Commissioner Bauer, Commissioner Ginsburg, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I am honored to be among this august body. Let me just try to further some of the comments that my colleague Kenneth Bennett has offered you, because I so agree. In fact, Dean Logan and I agree a lot on the circumstances that we both find ourselves in. So I don't want to repeat what Kenneth has so eloquently pointed out. We do agree that the whole point of us trying to develop a voting system that's better than what we have right now is for the benefit of the voter. What my ultimate hope for this group and for what your work might mean, especially sooner rather than later, is that we end up on the same path that I am on, and that perhaps a lot of people in this room who are conducting elections might end up on, is that we are going to end up at the same intersection in your work to try to find ways to shorten lines and to speed up voter processing on election day, the various election days, is exactly the same path I am on in trying to provide a better voting system for my community. Because the things that, in a very complicated list of solutions, the things that will make it easier and faster for voters to vote are the kinds of convenience issues, electronic solutions, device-based solutions that you have been hearing about over the last several meetings. All are also tied to the electronic solutions that are going to make that possible. The paper solutions that we seem to be reverting to right now that have come about because of the lack of progress in electronic voting, partly because of standards, partly because of voter lack of confidence, have caused us to go back to paper. But that's going to be a temporary, even boomerang type of effect, because the voter group is going to push us, as you've heard from many other people today, toward the kinds of programs and the kinds of delivery to our voters that's going to force electronic voting. You can't have a paper-based system in any community of any size and offer vote centers and electronic and early voting, and certainly not remote voting in a paper-based system. Therefore, we are ultimately headed down the path, if we want faster lines and better service to voters, that offers some form of electronic voting. And if we're talking about electronic voting for the future, we must be talking about something that voters can trust better. The minute we are all thrown into the environment where we're buying new voting systems, the criticisms, the awful, terrible, rock-throwing criticisms that many of us went through 10 years ago will resurface in a heartbeat. And I just don't want any of us to have to ever go through that again. When we very first were placed in the environment where we all adopted electronic voting, there were a lot of us that were ill-prepared, not experienced, not trained for how to handle electronic voting. So there was a lot of fallout. There were a lot of us who had to rely on our vendors to provide that kind of support. There were a lot of experts and officials who conduct election who did not survive that criticism during that time period. They were left by the side of the road. Those of us who are left, though, and those of us who are still in this business, are a lot smarter than we were back in 2006 or just a few years before that. And I think we can handle new and improved electronic voting systems in ways that our voters can come to trust. I think we will have to go through a whole new period of gaining their trust and proving that these systems work. So, which is why I think it's so important that the work that some of the academics are doing, like Philip Stark and like Josh Benelow, in proving up, in doing post-election audits and in comparing one-on-one the electronic vote to some kind of paper receipt or paper record is so very important. To get y'all down the road to where you can say these are the kinds of things that would speed up voting for voters is exactly the kind of thing that's going to be preparing us for the future when we take on more and more electronic voting. I also think that the improvements that we make in electronic voting now, as we begin to rethink the kinds of proof that we need, are going to put us into our next generation that's going to take us over into what we're going to need for internet voting. We can't use this internet for internet voting for the future, but electronic voting that does answer these questions about security is the next step to take us there. So ironically, or in a good way, our intersection where we need to provide ways for stronger proven elections to our electorate and better ways to treat them, while at the same time you're trying to find better ways to deal with lines and better ways to treat them. We are going to be hitting at exactly the same time, and your problems in trying to answer that question are exactly my problems. I am so thrilled that we're having the opportunity to have this conversation. Now, in summary, what I'd like to just say that it is extremely difficult to be a county, even granted the capital of the state of Texas and a large urban area. It is difficult to be on your own, a local jurisdiction, trying to redesign, Atlas trying to hold up the world. And yet, like a lot of counties, the only difference between me and maybe most elections administrators is I have a louder mouth. We, as many people already know, I cannot wait around until God delivers me the answer. My jurisdiction will kick me out of office, and who knows what would happen to us if I just sit around and wait for the answer to come. I feel that it is my obligation as an elected official charged with taking care of these voters to push this, to give them what they are asking for. And what they are asking for is convenience and faith and something a whole lot better than just trust. They need verified electronic voting. They want all of the things that you want and that perhaps we should have delivered an electronic voting 10 years ago. We know, lessons learned, we now know. To get past the point where perhaps Travis County is going to be successful at going out and beating a whole new plowshare election system so that we can have a whole new pathway that other people can follow. Maybe we'll be successful at that. I really hope so. It's a scary path to walk. I'm going to continue to walk it no matter how many times my knees knock together, not because it's fun, not because of anything else, but because I have no choice. My jurisdiction is demanding, differently from Dean's jurisdiction. Dean's jurisdiction is, Dean Logan, LA County, is demanding a process by which they can all feel like they can develop a new system for the future that they like. My jurisdiction is saying to me, we know what we want. We want electronic voting that has an auditable receipt that can prove up the electronic tally, and we want it now. My goal is, or my job is to deliver a system. Dean's is to include everybody in a process that will ultimately deliver a system. I have to put it on the table a whole lot faster. So what I would suggest to you is I'm going to be looking very closely at what you come up with, because I need help, I need support, I need guidance. I need for all of the elections administrators to also be talking about the fact that I'm not alone. Travis County is not the only jurisdiction that's running into problems with a decaying or an aging system. I don't mean decaying heart. Sorry, wrong word. An aging system. There's nothing wrong with it. An aging system that ultimately is going to need to be replaced, and a jurisdiction that is impatient, tapping their foot, and wanting it to be done right now. I cannot quit, and our demand for additional security is, I think, entirely appropriate. And I'm just so incredibly grateful for the bright. I mean, you have some excellent people on this committee who do know what they're talking about, and I appreciate the opportunity for input. And please not only wish me luck, but I would welcome your help and advice.
Well, we offer, at a minimum, we offer you luck.
Thank you.
We'll try to be helpful too. Co-Chair Ginsburg, would you like to open this up?
I would be happy to. If I could, let me ask a somewhat direct and difficult question for our edification, especially mine and Bob's as non-election administrators. We heard from the vendors this morning, Mr. Bennett, you said you heard many common themes from what you're trying to achieve and what the vendors talked about. Yet, both of your jurisdictions found the current market lacking in terms of what you could find. And Mr. Masterson, you advise many jurisdictions on how to proceed in this process. So just to start, if you would describe for us in sort of layman's detail what you find lacking in the current offers on the market, the current systems on the market, to help us sort of build up to where we would like to get in terms of talking about the future. Who wants to jump in first?
I'll attempt to answer that. Well, I mean, on just the, one of the simple answers to that is that Los Angeles County is a very large jurisdiction. We have a large number of polling places, and so the deployment process that we have to undergo and our custody control process that we have to manage really requires a system that is not it does not involve a lot of heavy equipment, a lot of a lot of large equipment, difficult to handle. Also, from the standpoint of process control, I don't know how to explain it, but when you have 100 precincts that you're managing on election night, you have a lot more flexibility in what kind of products you can roll out. But when you have 5,000 precincts, and every one of those has to be a tally center, it becomes very difficult because there's certain process controls you have to have in place to make sure that every vote every ballot gets scanned, and the poll workers are setting up the equipment correctly, and it's simple to use. And we have really big challenges with training. And it has more to do with the scale of our operation and not so much that we conceptually do anything different than anybody else. So on the tally side, we, and I think Dean throws these numbers out a lot, so they're not new. But in the 2008 election, on election night, we counted 2.5 million ballots in the span of 5 hours. And that span was really driven by the time it takes for the ballots to get back to us. I mean, so whatever voting system goes out that's deployed out in the polling place has to be integrated with a tally system that enables us to tally that quickly. I mean, we have a huge volume that we have to tally, and so we know that one of the values that we have in our county for process control and making sure that we do elections right, we do them accurately and correctly, we value a central tally system. So whatever system is deployed out there has to also be compatible with that. And so the other issues that we have to face are with just what is the ballot? Again, for 100 precincts, and you have a full face ballot with all the names of the candidates and contests on there, and even if it's multi-page, it's something that you can deal with. But when you're dealing with, it was on 2008 was 4 million ballots. Right now we have a ballot that's it's optical scan, but it's basically the old punch card ballot. It's the IBM 312 format ballot. Small, easy to handle, very compact. When we talk about going to a new voting system, how do we handle that? There's so many sort of technical questions that I know that the vendors are out there exploring, and I'm not. So it's not to say that the vendors can't do it. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that right now it's not there, but in our turning to the voters to really understand what it is that we want to do and what it is that we value, it tells us that what's there is not it's not going to be sufficient to meet the principles that we've established in our voting system assessment project. So I don't know if that makes sense, but
sure. And then any other commissioners should certainly indicate any follow-up questions they have, but can you specifically sort of match up by voter expectation and by deficit and what's available? Can you be very concrete about that? If you were to sort of create a hierarchy of the expectations that matter most and the ways in which the current technological alternatives fall short of meeting those expectations, could you state that with some specificity?
Well, I'll try. I mean, I would say accessibility is the big issue.
Pardon me?
Accessibility is one of the key drivers, especially that last mile of getting sort of hands-free casting a paper ballot. How do you do that? I think is one of the key ones that poses a challenge, and I think it poses the challenges to what the vendors are doing right now. I know that Dominion has one that we looked at today, for example, that it looked really neat, but in my mind, when I look at that device and I try to imagine that device being deployed to 5,000 polling places, it's a little. I mean, for us, and we're used to it, it's a little bit mind-boggling. It's really. It's kind of what we've been talking about already. How do you merge accessibility requirements with the security requirements, which right now are telling us that we have to have a paper ballot, a verifiable paper ballot. And so those two things combined with how that manifests itself in systems, and is that system deployable in the county of Los Angeles? The basic answer is we don't think so right now. We're not saying it's not possible, and we believe through the sort of innovative design approach that we're taking, we think we're going to be able to arrive at concepts that will do that. I mean, I think it was Juan who said earlier, this is a challenge that we're willing to sort of step up to. I believe the technology will get there. It's just that right now it's having some difficulty with issues of portability and modularity, and how do we implement it in an environment like Los Angeles? It's the County of Los Angeles. It's just, I know that's not probably as specific as you want it to be, but
That's helpful, and perhaps Ms. Debevore and Mr. Masterson could add, from their perspective, their comments.
Yeah, and I'll try to be quick, but I think the answer from talking to election officials, and to be clear, the systems now have done what we've asked them to do, and so it's now, technologies move forward and there's different expectations, right? And people walk in now and they say to themselves, why am I filling out a Scantron sheet, right? That was, I did that for the SAT. And so there's challenges there. I think the answer specifically for you is integration and scalability. Right now, the systems we have now, right, wrong, or indifferent, if you buy a VR system and a voting system from the same vendor, it's likely they won't communicate with each other, right? And that is a type of integration that at the time didn't, was what it was, but now it wouldn't be acceptable. We want our systems to be able to talk and share data with each other and integrate with each other so that we have flexibility to then be scalable. So what works for Cuyahoga County as far as size, scalability, what the voters expect, Morgan County, where we have, 2 part-time director and deputy directors, that's not the same system. It's just not fundamentally the same system, but under, HAVA and the purchases and the way certification and everything came about and how quickly the money flooded the market, they own the same system. They don't own as many of them, but they own the same system. And that lack of ability to scale the systems to what's necessary and usable for those jurisdictions in a state like Ohio is a big challenge. Having to deploy the systems in small counties that are used in the big counties isn't a reasonable expectation at times. There's got to be another more affordable, more easy to use way to do that. And that's the kind of scalability and interoperability that I think needs to be out there.
Dana Debevois, Travis County Clerk. I am not a technical person. I've had to learn to put on that hat and wear it as best I can over the years. But let me try to give you, from just a layperson's perspective, one answer that you can put in your notes and say, this is one thing that is different today that we should be asking for today that we didn't have in the past. Lesson learned. For example, one of the things that's going to be called for in Travis County's RFP to ask for better electronic voting, the things that we should have in the future, is a new development called homomorphic encryption. Homomorphic encryption is a mathematical tool that allows you to prove up that, I'm going to do my best here, that what comes out of this system in a ones and zeros mathematical way can be proven up, that what comes out of this system and then runs through another scanner and is produced over here, then turns around and gets matched up back later, is in fact the same ones and zeros. Was that not too bad?
That's a good start.
That's a good start. Listen, I get a C- from Revest. I'm completely thrilled. Okay. All right. If you could just take that little bit and let me compare that homomorphic encryption little bit that you maybe got a hold of right there with what was required in the past. We had nothing when electronic voting came out. The way you did security when you had electronic voting in the past was you reacted yourself with a procedure. In other words, the electronic voting systems that were given to us didn't have clear and clean code written. It was a bit of a jumble. Some companies did better than others. Some were truly terrible, and some were not too bad. But nobody had beautiful, clean code. Nobody. For example, if you wanted to make sure that one of the things that you would hear about was that, oh, well, something could happen. That was heard a lot. Something could happen, and it would flip all the votes. Some buried, flip switch thing would change all the votes halfway through, or it would change every 10th vote halfway through in the middle of the election, and you wouldn't be able to catch it. And so the answer to that, to reassure your voters that that was not going to happen, and that in fact everybody could sleep calmly because you knew that was not going to happen, was that you did what was called parallel monitoring. Well, parallel monitoring is a test that the election administrator does that tricks the system into thinking that it's in a real live polling place environment, when in fact it is in a test environment, and you are watching and filming it, and you know if it messes up one ballot at the moment it occurs. Now, that's not the best in the world because you're still catching it after the fact, but it is a powerful procedure for catching it at least at the time. How many people in the elections community had the wherewithal and the resources to conduct parallel monitoring? Not very many. I did it. How many people even took seriously logic and accuracy testing? You know, those were the ways that you dealt with security for your electronic voting system. We should have had security built into the systems in the first place. Examples like homomorphic encryption. All right. Now let me give you another. This 360-degree trying to defend against is unsustainable and not even really doable for an elections administrator. Even when you try to do it, there's always some other, bad guy's always going to think of some new trick for you, and you're going to be turning around to your 361st degree and trying to defend against that. It is a never-ending losing battle. So, we have to give up on that approach and let the system have its own security built in. One of the best ways to do that is to say, okay, VPAT isn't really what we were looking for, but there is a way to have a piece of paper in there that verifies against that electronic ballot, especially if you include homomorphic encryption on top of it, because the public isn't going to understand homomorphic encryption. I'm still working on it. But they're going to understand that there's a receipt or some kind of piece of paper. The difference that we're looking for here in the new systems is that it isn't batch to batch. It isn't grand total election sums to grand total paper sums. It is one ballot to one electronic ballot matched up in a way that's easy to find, which is what Philip Stark's contribution to the field is. One-on-one ability to pull it out, okay? Big difference in security, all right? And then finally, we failed to perhaps sell the best or make it clear about the best and the worst of electronic voting. With electronic voting, the public relations or the public education part of it should have said, this is the very best thing for accuracy, for privacy, absolutely for accessibility, no doubt about it, and for speed of results. But when it comes to dealing with transparency or dealing with recounts, not so good. We didn't make it clear that that was the environment that we were in. Perhaps if we had done that, voters would have gotten the idea that they're getting a whole lot of good stuff and they're sacrificing a couple of things over here, and we need to deal with a couple of things over here, not throw it all out in favor of something that's going to cut convenience for the future. Okay, that's good enough. Thank you.
Questions?
On a completely different note, sort of, but not really, I guess. We talk a lot about usability from the voter's perspective, which I think is, of course, critical. But you mentioned training. So my question is, we have to have systems that are usable for our poll workers, for our election officials that are in the smaller jurisdictions where they do this. It's 1/10 of their job. So twofold. One is, for those of you who are creating your own system and you're talking about the usability, are you taking into consideration the usability of how to set up the system, the interface with the actual workers, and how are you doing that, and what are the key elements that you're looking for so that it doesn't, as Professor Gilbert said, get set up in the corner and left there because people have difficulty setting it up or are afraid of it. So, that's one aspect of it. And then for Mr. Masterson, because you're not creating your own system at this particular moment, at least that we are aware of, I know you're plotting to rule the world, but when you look to purchase a system or recommend a system for the state, is that an element that you take into consideration?
Okay, maybe I could start with this one. how do we know that our newly designed systems are going to be common sense and easy enough for our election judges in the polling places and in early voting to be able to deal with it? Well, I think the number one thing you do is you count number of pieces. How many pieces of whatever you're using are going to go into a polling place? Once you start getting over 2 or 3, you've maxed out what people can do. With the design, with Star Vote right now, we're a little heavy on numbers of pieces. I'd like to see it shrunk down. The other thing is, how much does it weigh, and what are you going to put it in to carry it around? Real basic stuff. And colors. Color-coded. The pink box plugs into the blue box. Very, and it sounds even condescending. It is not. It's about it being error-free. When we know, what was it, Juan told us that, or no, I'm sorry, it was probably Kathy that told us that error is personal error, human error is the number one problem even in international elections. The other thing too is that I think when you're looking at a final design, there should be an elegant flow to the way voters, go through a polling place. There shouldn't be any stumbles or backflows or anything if you can avoid it. And yet, every single procedure that we do has a backflow in every single thing. You're always going back to a reader or going back to a something or allowing a spoiled ballot. So, you're trying to design an elegant stream through everything, and yet you have to allow for the backup. So those are some of the things to consider. Very, very simple and yet difficult to implement.
Yeah, I mean, there is one of the principles that we developed early on in the project and working with our VSAP advisory committee, and some of the research that we did was the need for portability, the simplicity of setup, also other things related to that, sort of the boot up of the system. I mean, there's certain things about systems that will throw a poll worker because they're expecting, because when they turn on their phone, it comes up in a matter of seconds. But when they turn on the voting system, the voting device in the polling place, and it's sitting there doing its thing, and and then they call in and this thing's broken, and it's not. It's just where the screen's been turned off. So there's other sort of aspects to it that can really throw the voters. But I mean, I would just echo what Dana said, is that it's simplicity, the simplicity of the setup, the portability, the compactness. In LA County, we use a distribution model, which is called an inspector supply pickup, where rather than have to manage truck routing throughout the county, which is really complex, and it's just hard to do. Just ask anybody from FedEx. It's hard to do that kind of stuff. USPS. So we abandoned that model quite a while ago and found that by paying a stipend to the poll worker, if they came and picked it up, that was much more effective in getting the materials out there. But the problem was we were relying on them to come and pick it up. So now you have a situation where you don't know what they're going to come with. They might come with a tiny little compact, a little smart car, and you go, wow, how do they get all that equipment in there? I mean, that's kind of extreme, but those are the kinds of considerations that we have to take into account as well.
Thank you, Commissioner McGeehan, and then Commissioner Grayson.
Matt may have a response. Oh, I'm sorry, Matt, I apologize.
No problem. I was just going to say yes, and then just no. Absolutely, the answer is yes, and it's interesting as technology and society has become more mobile dependent. The expectation for that portability has become even more expected, right? And so your poll workers, your election officials, they expect this. They expect the ease of use. I think there's an important kind of caveat to that, in that, and I'm sorry, I have a 3-year-old and a 6-month-old at home, so now this is how I think. But I love my stroller because all I have to do is pull it out and it unflaps, right? It just pops right up, right? And that is an awesome thing for me as a parent. I can do it with one hand. And so, as nice as setting up an iPad and a printer and a this or that, and that may work for some jurisdictions, there is something very nice about just having the voting system that you can put there, roll it out, whatever, and you're on your way. And there's an attractive kind of feature to that kind of hardware setup as well. And I think that's dependent on what the sophistication and knowledge of what the election official needs. And so my recommendation, Tammy, is not one way or the other, but instead to push back on the election official that's looking at systems to say, what is your setup? What are your resources? What's your typical poll worker like? Because we do have sophisticated counties that can do a variety of things, right? And so that's kind of the balance. That's why it isn't one size fits all, as we all know. I mean, that's how it goes.
I just had a couple of follow-up questions for Dana. 2 questions and 1 compliment. Let me give you the compliment first so I don't forget. I just wanted to say, Dana, what a leader you have been in electronic voting. And yes, she does bear the battle scars because it really was a very rough place to be in 2006 when all of a sudden we had all the scrutiny, nobody understood these systems, yet the election officials had to defend it. And Dana, you're a real leader to set up the best practices and procedures to try and safeguard that. So I hear you loud and clear when you don't only want to rely on procedures to guarantee the security of the system. But I was curious how this version of a VVPAT that you'll be creating, is that accessible? Are you going to deal with that a different way? And do you think that now that the DREs are more improved and maybe the whole community has taken more account of security issues, we don't want to overcorrect either. As Merle King was saying earlier, what are our goals for a system? And I'm just curious how you're handling it. So accessibility.
Dana DeBevois, Travis County Clerk. Sometimes I go into my daydream in fairyland, and I think, when we buy a new voting system that's fully electronic, nobody's ever going to worry about the audit, or rather the recount part again. Nobody's ever going to say anything again. And those old awful days of being, death threats and all that awful stuff is never going to happen again. And maybe that's true. But I don't think so. I think that people still demand. I think there is some comfortableness with people's current voting systems, but I also think that there's some a little bit of fatigue in crying about the systems that they have. I think voters get it that we bought a system. Okay, we got to live with what we have right now. But when it comes to buy a new one, I think they're all going to say, okay, then now give us what we've been asking for 10 years. I don't think there's going to be this let up that we sort of feel like maybe we're going to get right now, because it doesn't feel like there's anybody screaming right now. I don't think that's going to last. I think they're going to come back even more so and say, we've learned even more. Why haven't you put it to use? Now, the accessibility issue about the paper, I want to find a better word for receipt, but I'm going to use a receipt for a little while because it's just a quick way to get a handle on what we're talking about. All of the second chance voting that would normally occur with a DRE does occur in Star Vote. So all of the get your second chance to make sure you've got it all correct happens, and then it prints out just your choices, just the voter selections. But once that paper is printed out, what the disability folks would teach me is that then has the right to undergo second chance as well. So the idea is that this would be a machine readable document that could then be put through either the station's reader that would then be an audio readback, or the person's own portable reader that would audio read back the piece of paper. The one thing that we don't want to do, and this is so germane to your piece of work, is we don't want to have it at the ballot box, where they're stopping at the ballot box to listen to it be read to them at the ballot box. We don't want that'll pile up things at the ballot box. So it's some separate other station, and we also have to be careful that doesn't run afoul of standards too, because there's specific standards that call for that. But the idea is that there would then be some second chance with the piece of paper, and at both opportunities for second chance, either electronic or paper receipt, you could, at either case, spoil and start all over. Or, and this is also important for accessibility and security, at both of those opportunities, you would have the opportunity to challenge. Now, a challenge vote is a way to say, I don't trust the system, I think it's lying. It's not like a spoiled ballot. It's a way of saying, I want this ballot set aside. I don't want it to count as a vote, but I want it double-checked later. That is also built into Star Vote, a way to do a challenge, and it will be that'll be an extra security measure and really important for security, and something that the general public participates in at the polling place on the spot. Very powerful security message to the public. So I hope that answers both your questions. Thank you. And thanks for the good word. I appreciate that. You almost made me cry.
I've got two hopefully quick questions for Kenneth and Dana. One would be, and I realize you're both early in your process. You haven't issued RFPs, you obviously haven't gotten responses back. But I'm curious, what's the feedback from the vendor community as to their interest in probably submitting an RFP? And you're, probably you, Dana, are further along, where they probably have a general idea what you're talking about, so you may have a more precise answer than you would in LA. And the second would be, we've been talking a lot about the delay in certifying patches, or how that process doesn't really work. And I'm just curious, and again, maybe you haven't kind of fully thought of this through because you're not quite there yet. How do the two systems that you created, or the approach to creating a system, how are you dealing with that? It might be interesting for us to hear that, because that may help us answer how to, what's some advice to give on a larger redo of the standards or certification process.
Okay, let me let somebody else comment on the second part of your question, and I'll take the first and third. The first is, how are the vendors responding to our unusual position of asking for a system that does not exist, and yet trying to stay within the bounds of standards now, at least as best we can.
Yes.
It's not, but we're going to try to stay as close as we can. It has changed. It has evolved. When we very first started this process 2 years ago, starting with a citizens panel, a rather large study group within Travis County of a variety of people. The vendor community was not particularly warm to this idea, just in a nutshell, and didn't particularly respect our effort to go this far. It has evolved from through a couple of stages where vendors have said to me, "Oh, we've got 80% of what you want." To now, what I'm getting is more and more from vendors the realization on their part that it may not look like what they have in their inventory, but that they do have the capability to offer an important contribution to this industry stepping forward, and that they probably are looking at a collaboration. And I would say to them, or I would say to you about them, is that it's been a slow progress for them to come to that point, because let's face it, we're talking about their livelihoods and their income, and them being able to predict and understand a revenue stream in this new world is a hard place for them to get to. And I think part of me pushing for them to get to that place is the recognition that their new revenue stream is coming from serving as integrators and people who can help do modifications for the future, not people who are collecting a software maintenance fee.
And that's where your having it broken up into different modules helps with that, I guess?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And the idea that if you had either open source or a common data format, that allows it to go into other areas. But just because they can pick that up either at no cost or virtually no cost doesn't mean you're done. If you're another jurisdiction, you wanted to take the Star Vote's basic software and go use it yourself, you would still need to have a vendor, an integrator, to come along and customize it for yourself and build out the things that would fit your county and your state law. Well, it's ideal for the election companies who have been in that business for years to do that for you. So I think they're beginning to see a new world for themselves that was perhaps not obvious to them 2 years ago. So
that's good.
Okay. And
I mean, that's good, and that's a good answer, and it's good.
Yes, I hope it is. Because if we don't, then I end up losing out on a whole lot, a wealth of experience and knowledge in a place where I'm not qualified to do this alone. I'm not a vendor. I'm not a designer of these systems, and I need them to do this. But I need them to be completely out of their box and out of their comfort zone. They cannot do this like they used to do this. And to the extent that they don't recognize that now, they're staying in an old world that's probably dead by the time this system gets implemented, in my opinion.
I would echo a lot of what Dana said. One of the things that's maybe a little bit different is part of our voter engagement and our stakeholder engagement process. One of the values that came out of it, one of the principles in our general voting systems principles that we developed for the project, was that we found that our voters were comforted by the fact that the system that we have is, when I'm talking about our Inca Vote Plus system, so the marking the ballots and the tabulation system, that it's owned by the county, and that if we want to, we can open that up for anybody to see. And there's a lot of interesting things that you can do with your voter community, with those out there that are concerned about transparency and integrity, and things like, opening up your source code on a public-facing platform and allowing people to do unit testing. There's a lot of things that you can do when you own it. And so there was a general value that ownership of the system, for a system that that manages elections and confers power to incoming administrations, that was a good thing. So it kind of changes the equation from the very beginning. But I agree, we don't see. I want to make that very clear. And I remember Merle and I talked about it briefly at the EAC meeting in January, that we don't want to be a vendor. That's not what we want to do. What we want to do is drive the innovation process. We really see that the value that we can bring to it through this belief that through a voter-oriented, iterative design process, that we can arrive at concepts that at some point will have to be built. And then when we get to that point, there will be RFP processes that have to take place to build components, and there will be, the vendors will be involved at that point. We're not there yet because we know it's there, and we know that there's licensing issues that we have to deal with. I was talking with Joe Hall earlier about that. There's a lot of things that we'll need to think about, but we do know that we want the ownership as a value, and obviously the innovation, the things that we need, we want to be able to drive that. But it's not necessarily an us versus them. And that's, I think, what we want to be clear about, is that we're not in the business of being manufacturers. We're in the business of driving innovation.
Sure, Matt.
Real quick, just to jump in, because I think your question about upgrading software is an important one, and it speaks to actually the concept of the election official as not only the system developer but the system maintainer. So your question was, how are you going to maintain your system? And this is not at all a critique on what either Kenneth or Dana are doing, but that's a very real change for an election official now, right?
Right.
And that has a lot of implications, and that's coming about not only in this area, but we have election officials creating their own e-poll books, and there's implications to the fact that you're not only designing this e-poll book, you have to maintain that e-poll book, and what all goes into that. What's your staff look like? How does that work? And that is a fine approach, but there are a lot of extra implications with something like that. And so as election officials embark on this kind of ownership quest, that's an important thing to keep in mind, because it's not enough that you roll out this shiny new car, but then you got to make the car run for as long as you need it.
Thanks.
I just wanted to add to that it goes back to that concept of integrator. I mean, we're going to have relationships with vendors for support. If we have an integrator that helps us build the system, I could see that person, like you said, being there to manage that process. I don't think that would. I mean, obviously we'll be involved if we own the system, but there's a services-oriented role now as opposed to a product manufacturing role.
Yeah, I mean, as I heard somebody this morning mention IBM, and IBM used to make computers, and I guess they still make some stuff, but they don't make computers anymore. But they make a lot more money for the corporation because they provide that service, the consulting service, the management service, and all that.
Okay, we'll close out now with a question for Commissioner Patrick.
I get the last word. I'm so happy. So one of the questions that we've been struggling with and that we will need to discuss is how we provide our services to limited English proficiency voters. And so this is mainly a question for Kenneth, but for Dana as well, because the complexity of the ballot is no more complex than it is in Los Angeles County with 11 or 12 languages now. 12 languages. And with the system that you're using currently, you have the ability to provide that in a single marked ballot in all of the different languages because the ballot itself really has no text on it or very little text. So my question is, moving forward, we've had conversation in some jurisdictions that have provided multilingual ballots, so not just bilingual but multilingual, and the challenges that creates with an incredibly long, complex ballot. We've heard testimony that it's better for voters to have both English and the covered language side by side, or at least on a single document. And we've also heard from some voter groups that they would prefer, in many of the current systems, you select the language and that's the ballot language of choice that you receive. But some of them do allow for you to go back and forth between languages. So as you're grappling with this new system, with your situation, what path are you taking and what are your voters telling you that they would prefer, if you've gotten to that conversation yet?
Well, I mean, we haven't gotten into the details of that. I think that from a practical standpoint, providing 12 languages on one single ballot is obviously not a solution. Not on a paper ballot, but and we have in some cases done actually in certain elections we've been felt compelled to do a true bilingual ballot, but we don't normally do that. The ballot's usually in English, and then we translate it in a sample ballot booklet so that people can see the ballot and all the other materials in a translation. You know the designs that we've come up with so far, which again they're first stage designs, and they're be an iterative process, and they will probably change. But the design that we've come up for really focuses on the an electronic interface, and so I would say that one of the big benefits of an electronic interface for marking the ballot is precisely that, being able to give all voters in a universal way the ability to select whatever language they want to see the ballot in. As far as paper ballots go, I would think that, for vote by mail, for example, as long as that continues, it's going to be a situation where the voters we're going to want to innovate in the process by which we allow voters to specify what language they want to vote in, making that process easier and getting that ballot out to them more quickly. It's again, we're not going to be able to just produce a ballot with all the languages on it and just send it to everybody. So that's what we focus on, and that's one of the big areas that we are focusing on in our department. And when we talk about innovation, we're not just talking about on the voting system. We're trying to innovate everything about the voting experience, including all of the pre-voting activities that voters do, including being able to easily and intuitively to communicate with our department so that we know what language they want to vote in and being able to deliver the service. So.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll take a 10-minute break and then return for the last panel and presentation. Thank you.